Okay, shall we start? I think we shall start. So I want to welcome everyone to this, which is already the 8th session of the Fall 2025 workshops in the history of material texts. As most of you know, I'm Jerry Singerman, Senior Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollock, the Curator of Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. We are aided as ever in all we do by our Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, Priya Nambrath, who is also a doctoral candidate in South Asian Studies here at Penn. Now, we ask those of you who are in the room that you please write your name on the sign-in sheet that Priya has just started circulating around the table. And we ask, too, that if you're not already on our listserv and would like to be to get our weekly announcements, that you write your email address on that attendance sheet as well. Now, for those of you who are joining us remotely, you should know that you owe Priya everything, for she is the person who will make sure that you can see and hear us, and that when the time comes for you to join the discussion, that we can hear and see you. So please silence yourselves for now, but make yourselves known at the appropriate time, whether by posing a comment in the chat or even better, by using the raised hand function on your computers so that we may call upon you directly. And if any of you attending remotely also wish to be added to the listserv, Priya can handle that as well. Just privately send her your contact information in a chat. Now, as many of you know, this workshop was founded in 1993 by Peter Stallybrass, who can still often be found looking over our shoulders from his perch on the screen behind me. Peter has shaped the ways in which many of us have come to think about the history of written communication and the material forms that it has taken over the centuries. If we are proudly and resolutely heterogeneous in our range of topics and approaches, there are certain strands that have run through our discussions over the years. One of these is surely the consideration of how manuscript culture did not end with the invention of movable type. On the contrary, manuscript and print continued and continue to thrive simultaneously. Indeed, the very category of the manuscript is unimaginable without and was brought into being only by the advent of print. Now, pride in our resolute heterogeneity notwithstanding, it's only with two infrequent exceptions that we have thought in this workshop about the survival of manuscript culture beyond its European and American manifestations. It's to our benefit, I trust, that Josh Mugler does otherwise. Josh Mugler took his undergraduate degree at Oklahoma Baptist University and his master's in theological studies from the Harvard Divinity School. He earned his PhD in theological and religious studies from Georgetown University in 2019, with a focus on Christian-Muslim relations in 10th and 11th century Syria. Having already, however, joined the staff of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Collegeville, Minnesota, the previous year, as Associate Cataloger for Arabic and Syriac manuscripts. In 2020, he was promoted to Curator of Islamic Manuscripts, and in 2022, his portfolio expanded with his appointment as Curator of Eastern Christian and Islamic Manuscripts, a position he holds concurrently with what we may consider his fortuitous move to Philadelphia about a year and a half ago. Now, on the chance that the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HMML as it's endearingly known, may fly under the radar of some people in attendance, note that it is an extraordinary and rather unusual institution, a manuscript library with hardly any manuscripts of its own, a center of huge importance in the world of manuscript studies that is attached to a small Benedictine college, St. John's University, located on 3,000 remote acres of Minnesota lakes and forests. Huh? What?
Somebody needs to mute.
They should mute. Please mute yourselves. Now, for medievalists of my generation, it was also the place with well-nigh legendary European microfilm holdings. founded in 1965 to photograph some 53,000 pre-modern manuscripts that had survived the Second World War in Benedictine monasteries in Austria and Germany. Its mission soon expanded to Switzerland, England, Ireland, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Malta, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and beyond. As its website informs us, quote, the collections in Latin and vernacular languages provide a deep resource for any study of pre-modern European history and culture, as well as science, medicine, music, and law. These have migrated, of course, from microfilm to other digital formats in the 6 decades since the founding, and now comprise almost 500,000 full or partial manuscripts photographed in partnership with more than 1,500 libraries and archives worldwide. Now, this much I knew kind of, at least in outline, though, of course, without those numbers attached. What I did not know is that as early as 1973, or just a little more than a decade after its founding, in other words, and again in the language of the website, quote, just as Ethiopia descended into 12 years of chaos and civil war, the Himmel was already spearheading an effort to photograph what would eventually grow to a collection of more than 9,000 Ethiopian manuscripts, and that the Ethiopian project was but the beginning of a broader commitment on the part of the Himmel to photograph and preserve endangered manuscript materials, contemporary as well as historical, in any part of the world, European and non-European, Christian and non-Christian, riven by war and political or religious violence. So go to its website and you'll find a mission statement with no mention of Benedictine or any other Christian monasticism. And I think importantly for our talk or our seminar, no geographical and no temporal markers or parameters whatsoever. Rather, you'll read simply, though it's not simple at all really, that, quote, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library photographs, catalogs, and advances access to at-risk manuscript collections to preserve and share the handwritten history. So please join me now in welcoming Josh Mugler, who will speak this evening on one aspect of that mission, on the matter of manuscripts and violence in modern Mesopotamia.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and really great overview of some of the history and work of Himmel, and I'm very happy to share some of that work with all of you. I will figure out how to share the screen here. Tell me if you can see and hear everything as you should. How does that look? There it is. Everyone can hear me both here and online. Is that right? Okay. Well, welcome everyone. And again, thanks so much for the introduction. This is a real honor to be invited to speak to all of you. And I'm excited to share some of the things that I've seen in my cataloging work. Focused on this topic of manuscripts and violence in modern Mesopotamia. To be honest, the title is a little too broad for what I'm going to be covering today. Firstly, because, so what I'll be talking about is basically limited to things that are in the Himmel collection, because that's what I have cataloged myself and know the best. And as a result, it will be focused on Christian manuscripts. What we've photographed in this region, Iraq and Turkey, has been Christian collections, monasteries, churches, etc., private libraries. And so it'll be manuscripts from that tradition, but also I'll be focusing on manuscripts in basically Arabic and Syriac and modern Aramaic dialects that are spoken by the Christian communities in this region. So I will mention a couple times the Armenian experience, which of course includes the genocide of World War I. That'll come in different ways, but I don't know Armenian, and so I can't really get into the ins and outs of those manuscripts, but hopefully the kind of Syriac Aramaic or Syriac Arabic Christian tradition will kind of suggest the richness of what is out there, because certainly Muslim, Jewish, Armenian, Christian, other language traditions are very much also producing manuscripts in the modern era, and have a lot to say in conversation with what I'll be talking about today. So I start with the image that I sent to Priya for this talk, which comes from a manuscript at the Austrian National Library. This is actually the only manuscript I'll discuss today that is not still in the region of Turkey or Iraq. So this one has been taken to Europe, like many manuscripts from this region. It's essentially it's called a book of protection. So it's essentially a book of prayers and charms that are designed to protect the user from various dangers, including some of the things that are pictured here. And you can see, there's weapons from different eras, all of which continued to be used at the time that this was copied in 1826. There's the handgun here is labeled pishto, so you can see that the word is just pistol, borrowed. But then you have the bow and arrow, the sword. That's something terrifying at the top. I don't know exactly what that is. But so these are the kinds of things that people were encountering probably too often, and were looking for ways to protect themselves against them. And there was generally kind of an idea that by depicting these things, kind of capturing them in the picture here, you can think about them in a way that that helps as you concentrate on your prayers to be protected against them. So moving into kind of the wider history here, I want to start with this figure, Nader Shah. He was the ruler of Iran in the early 18th century, and he was essentially, he overthrew the Safavid dynasty that had been ruling Iran for several hundred years. He founded a dynasty of his own, which lasted something less than 75 years or so. But he went on a very rapid series of conquests, which you can get a hint of from the map here on the left. And I've highlighted the city of Mosul on the left because you can see that it's right on the edge of where he was able to go in his conquest. So at this time, he would have been fighting in the west, the Ottoman Empire, in the east, various other powers. But in the west, he managed to defeat Ottoman armies multiple times. They had very little success against him. And in this time period, in the 1730s, he and his army laid siege to Mosul, which was the main city, as it still is, one of the main cities of northern Iraq. And this is a fairly obscure event in wider history, but it had a very real impact on the lives of the people there, which is preserved in multiple manuscript witnesses from collections that are still in Iraq today. The one on the left is in Syriac, the one on the right is in Arabic, but written in Syriac letters, so you call that Garshuni. But both of them, so the one on the Arabic one was written by an eyewitness to these events, someone from the smaller town of Karakush or Baghdida. And the author describes how Nader Shah laid waste to all these villages and was pillaging everywhere. His armies were rapidly moving through the surrounding countryside and the mountains. The governor of Mosul sent out a call for people from these various towns to come into the city and bring as many supplies as they could, both because they would be safer in the city and also because the city needed the supplies. So the author brought as much as they could into the city, and there endured the siege with the residents of Mosul and all the other surrounding villages. So both of these accounts are completely are missing the beginning and end. So As a result, we don't have an author's name for either of them because they would typically state their name in one of those places, if not both. So we have no way of knowing who the author is. There's very little chance that we ever will. But from the description, we can see that at least in the Arabic one, it was an eyewitness from Karakush. And the reason that this event was worthy of writing down and memorializing in this way is not only because it was a terrifying event for all involved. The city was surrounded and shelled by 18th century artillery for over a week. Many people died in the defense. Many people died in the villages around. The author describes the army going up into the mountains, attacking groups like the Yazidis and other religious groups up there. But the way that this event was played out is that the whole community of Mosul joined in the defense, and they eventually drove off the siege of Nader Shah, which was quite a triumph because he was basically on an unstoppable run of conquests at the time. He had no trouble at all with the Ottoman army in the field, but he was defeated by a kind of random collection of city dwellers and villagers who gathered there. And the author is very clear that, as it says at the top of folio 5 here, that the whole people of the city, Muslims and Christians and Jews, all joined in. So there's a real coming together of the community here. And in the wake of this event, these were not just events that came and went, but they actually had an impact on the power balance in the city going forward. So because of this great success and the multi-communal participation in it, the governor of Mosul gave the Christians great rewards and privileges and allowed them to repair and renovate, improve many of their churches, things that were often very difficult to get permission for in more normal circumstances. And so for the Christians who recorded these, it was important to remember, not just because it was a scary event, but also because it gave them a certain place in the community that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And they wanted to have a record of this so that if someone came in the future and said, "Why were you allowed to fix up this church?" Well, you might want to read the story of how we actually got here. So these are events that that need to be remembered because they have dramatic impacts going forward on all these communities. And I think the fact that we have two different anonymous witnesses to this, someone thought this was worth writing down. Neither of these, as far as I know, has ever come to the attention of, say, the scholarly community, Western scholars. But these manuscripts are there waiting to be examined. So that's just one example of the kind of violent encounters that were happening throughout the region. So there's a whole genre of poems in vernacular Aramaic, sometimes called laments or complaints, but they're not necessarily all sad. They often are. Some of them are just kind of stories about saints or biblical events, but many of them are about contemporary historical events and tend to kind of commemorate particular disasters, or there's some poems like this, Dorokyata, that are about famines, plagues, all sorts of things. It's a fairly wide-ranging genre of modern Aramaic poetry, and very little of it has actually been published or translated. But you can see some of the examples here. There was a major Kurdish attack on Al-Qush in 1832. We'll come back to this a couple times, actually. Then there was another poem about the same event that was written in 1932. So you can see that they're coming back and kind of commemorating the centennial of these events, thinking about their own history and preserving some of this in in a poetic format that would be easily understood by the community. There's a poem on the Russian-Turkish War of the 1870s, on the Hamidian massacres in 1895. There's a poem in Neo-Aramaic by Jacques Reteret, who was a French Dominican who lived in Upper Mesopotamia for decades, and wrote quite a bit in the vernacular Aramaic as well as in Armenian. He wrote about World War I. There's another directa about World War I. So all these things get commemorated and preserved in these manuscript traditions. So again, this manuscript culture, it continues to be very much alive well into the 20th century. Certainly in the 19th. In the 19th century, it's very much manuscript dominated throughout this region. It's a very rural region, a lot of communities that are living in monasteries or up in the mountains, mountain villages. They do not have easy access to print, and they don't necessarily want to print everything because they have these manuscript traditions. So even though it's very much modern events, there's still a lot of manuscript testimony to it, and that's what we're trying to make available through the work that we do at Himmel. So I just mentioned this this Kurdish emir Muhammad Pasha. He was the ruler of this town Rawanduz. He took advantage in the 1830s, 1820s and 30s of a sort of Ottoman power vacuum. The Ottomans were busy fighting the Egyptians, who were kind of asserting their independence. And so as a result, this eastern frontier region was once again a little bit open for conquest. And so Muhammad Pasha defeated several other Kurdish warlords in the area, and he also conquered a number of these towns that were often mixed, Christian, Muslim, Jewish towns, different language groups, different churches, etc. And this is another series of events that was commemorated by these Christian authors in multiple forms. So there's an anonymous Neo-Aramaic account of this. There's a homily about his attack on Jizre in Syriac by the bishop of that region. And so this is another series of events where people think that it's worth passing down this information. And he conquered these, but then he was pretty quickly suppressed by the Ottomans and eventually killed. And so so this was kind of a short-lived Kurdish supremacy, but it did have a lot of impact and created a lot of chaos in this region. And so it was commemorated multiple times. I just mentioned this. This was the Directa on the massacres of 1895, the Hamidian massacres of mostly Armenian people in this region. But this text is in vernacular Aramaic, so this is an Aramaic speaking Christian thinking about what's just happened to mostly Armenians, but also many his own compatriots as well. And this is another, many of these authors are just almost completely unknown. We have several manuscripts that the author copied, but very little. And so there's really a lot that is just really rich information, but has been, there's so little context for it. And it really, these manuscripts just give such a great window into a lot of areas that are very difficult to get good kind of historical information on many times, because they're rural communities. They're far up in the mountains often. They have limited contact with the outside world, but they're preserving their own history, and that's really exciting to get some of this window into those kind of local histories where you're getting beyond the kind of big events of the rulers in the cities and that sort of thing. Now getting into World War I, so much of the recent history of this region is completely rising and falling with the fortunes of World War I, because that's when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. All the borders were shuffled, new nation states were created, and there was just intense violence throughout that entire process that shaped so many people's lives. So during World War I, multiple people copied down this prayer that was attributed to Pope Benedict XV, that had been published and sent out. So we have one copy of it on the right in Arabic, on the left in vernacular Aramaic. This is actually on the Aramaic one. It's actually there's a real poignant kind of element of manuscript culture here, because it talks about how this was a prayer that was written for the war that happened in 1914 and 1915 and the war that happened in 1915 and 1916 and 1917. And then someone in a later purple pen has come through and written very small between the lines, and 1918 and 1919. So someone has that, like, the manuscript was copied in 1917, and then someone came and said, actually, this was not the end of it. It kept going for several years after that. And keep in mind that, as the manuscript indicates, World War I in the Ottoman Empire did not end in 1918. This was very much a continuing violent event that went through about 1922, and really shaped everyone's lives in that region. So you can see, people working with the manuscript heritage that they have also. The Chaldean Catholic Patriarch of Babylon, now Baghdad, kept a journal throughout this time period. And so we actually have 3 manuscripts that we photographed of his journal, one in a manuscript copy from 1969, and then that it was edited by this priest, Boutros Haddad, and he printed it in 1997 in Baghdad, which you see on the right. But it's not like a real publication necessarily. It's more like, he just kind of typed it up and had it printed. And I don't know how many copies of that would have gone out to his friends and community, but there's only a few, I'm sure. But this is again just a really rich eyewitness account of what was going on the ground, what World War I was like for someone in Baghdad. This is another account of World War I in Neo-Aramaic. It describes the war as Tufana, which is like the Arabic word Tufan refers to like the flood of Noah in the Bible, or it's directly related to the word typhoon that we have today. So this is a word that just means like the greatest disaster, the greatest catastrophe. And the author says that it began in Germany, Germania, which is a fairly unusual way to refer to Germany, but must have been interacting with possibly British or American missionaries, learning English names of countries, Germania. Yeah, so another account of someone who lived through this time period. And then there's a number of texts that go back to this figure, Israel Odo, who was Bishop of Mardin for several decades, Mardin in Southeast Turkey. This is a homily he wrote, a mimra, in classical Syriac, about this period, about the persecutions, the genocides of World War I, which, yeah, and then this is a full-length history of these events, history of the persecutions of the Christians of these cities, Armenians and Arameans, that occurred in the year 1915. We have 5 manuscripts of it from 1949 to 1971. Part of his draft copy is we photographed in Istanbul. So this is, I mean, it's kind of amazing. It's hundreds of pages of classical Syriac text. I mean, it's like if someone wrote a history of World War I in Latin or something. Like he really thought that that these events deserved not only attention and commemoration, but a real work of literary elegance and skill that draws directly on the classical Syriac tradition. And not only he, the author, gave it that attention, but it's obvious that people thought it was worthy of preserving because there are multiple people copying it down in manuscript for decades in the middle of the 20th century when they could have printed it. These manuscripts, I believe, they're preserved in Mosul and Baghdad. They were copied in mostly in those cities and in Aleppo. But the only publication in print of this is from Stockholm in 2015 with a Swedish translation, because there's such a large community of Syriac immigrants in Sweden that they have a number of their own kind of printing and scholarly apparatus there. But so unless you know Syriac or Swedish, you are unable to access this really important history of a series of catastrophic events. And as you can see, he's very much placing the Armenians and the Syriac speakers in community here as side by side victims of this genocide. In Syriac, it's typically called the Seifo, which means the sword. And then there's the Armenians have their own ways of commemorating it, but that's the way that this series of events is remembered in Syriac, as the sword. So beyond these like full-length texts and works that are actually written to commemorate these events, there's a number of just notes and colophons that are found throughout the manuscripts that also give us additional information about people's experience of these things. So this manuscript was copied in 1915 in Al-Qush, northern Iraq, and it provides, I think, about 3 or 4 pages of detailed account of what World War I, the beginning, the first year of World War I was like in this region. It's a book of funerals, funeral liturgies, but it says, in the year this was copied, France and England and Moscow went to war with Germany and Austria and our Sultan. And someone has, actually multiple someones have added little things in the margins, which I put in brackets, and Italy. Someone said, oh yeah, don't forget about Italy. And then someone also had to explain what our Sultan is, possibly because they were writing after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But then this is a note by Jacques Rétoré, who I already mentioned, a French Dominican missionary. He, as I said, he wrote a lot in vernacular Aramaic, but also in Armenian. But a lot of his Armenian work is now lost because it was left in Van at the Great Armenian Center there, and then was destroyed during what he calls the German War, as a Frenchman. Yeah, so as far as I know, most of these materials are now only exist in his note here, texts that he wrote or translated into Armenian, including a Life of Martin Luther, which is interesting. Yeah, so additional notes. These are all from one manuscript in Midyat, which has a really great history. You can see the manuscript was actually copied in 1838, and the note at the top here from the colophon is describing some of the same kind of context with the Kurdish conquests of that time period that I've already mentioned once or twice. But that after this period, the Sultan gave the local religious leaders permission to remove these Muslims, these non-Christians who had taken over the monastery where it was copied. So again, this brief kind of Kurdish supremacy is defeated by the Ottomans, and so the Christians are given their monastery back. But then, of course, in 1915, there was great destruction, and this later note mentions that. And then the book had to be ransomed from someone who had come into possession of it, some local Muslim who had taken it or had acquired it from someone who had taken it. But then it was just in terrible shape. And so this manuscript has been kind of reworked multiple times by people who cared for it, but it was in a pretty bad shape at some points in its history. More here, you can see how there's kind of continuing occasional violence that's happening throughout the 20th century, especially in this region, Southeast Turkey, There are ongoing conflicts between the Turkish government and the Kurds, and the Christians are kind of caught in the middle of this. You get accounts of things like in 1965, a church being destroyed. And then as time goes on, you start to get more and more notes where people are reflecting on the fact that many of their community members have moved to Europe. And so this note from 2008 mentions that this village had been mostly emptied out and that people had gone to Europe, like many other villages in the Tur Abdin region, which is this like Southeast Turkey mountainous region. So many people are deciding that these conflicts are too much to take, and they eventually move out for better opportunities. There's a real kind of powerful note here in 1975. This is a local priest had copied this manuscript in 1959, and then he came back 16 years later and noted that he was still there, the priest Malke of Einwardo. But he said that his flock has fled and departed for Germany, like his companions, the other priests, who could not endure the trials and set a bad example for the believers to sojourn in Europe. So he's just kind of reflecting on his place there with so many of his friends and community members have left. And then as we go on further and further into the future, then you have the ISIS conquests in 2014. Father Najib is the Chaldean Archbishop of Mosul today, but he's been one of our really long-standing best partners on manuscript digitization. His organization does incredible work all over Iraq and beyond on preserving a lot of the mostly Christian manuscript heritage. But he acquired this manuscript. He paid $350 for it in 2018, but he gives an account of what it was like living under ISIS and what happened to the community and the church. And at the time, there were essentially no Christians remaining in the city. Which leads us to, going beyond the actual textual content of the manuscripts to, what has been the experience of these manuscripts themselves throughout these violent events. So here's one Armenian example. This was one of just a handful that survived at the Catholicos of Cilicia in Adana, southeast Turkey, is now in Lebanon, but a really beautiful 13th century gospel book. This is a Syriac manuscript from 822, which survived for 1181 years, and then was completely destroyed when the Americans invaded Iraq in 2003. I think it was actually destroyed by a flood that was caused by the bombing. But so all the manuscripts were kind of held in this basement and flooded, and so many of them were lost like this. But this is basically all that's left. There's like 4 lines of Syriac text that are visible, and that's all that's left of it. So this is something where Himmel's work in the Middle East only started in 2003, and so this is something that we did not get to before it was destroyed. And so this is all we have left in terms of photography. There may be some older photographs of it as well. Now, a counterexample of that is something like Marbehna Monastery in Mosul, which we photographed before the ISIS occupation. They also managed to save many of their manuscripts by putting them in barrels and hiding them behind a wall. They built like a wall so that the invaders wouldn't know that there was a room there. And so then when ISIS was expelled, they went back to the monastery and took down the wall, and the manuscripts were still there. So that was a great success story. Although I'm sure some of the manuscripts came out in worse shape. But others were, Father Najib got as much as he could, put it into the trunks of cars of people fleeing into Erbil and all these things. So he's really done a lot to not only digitize, but also save as many of the physical manuscripts as he can. So these are just some examples, and I want to conclude by going back to the 18th century briefly. This is one of the most important religious leaders of this Syriac community at this time. Shamoun II, he died in 1740. He was trying to navigate the power struggles between the different, mostly Kurdish leaders in the area. And he ended up being executed because one of the Kurdish warlords had a Christian servant who wanted to marry his cousin, and that was illegal by church law. The Kurdish leader asked for an exemption for the servant, and Shamoun refused, and as a result, he was executed. But at some point in that process, he was called in before another leader and basically told to sing a song. And he, at least this is the story, but he, at some point in his life, he wrote this long hymn in Kurdish, which is really extremely rare to have almost any Christian text in Kurdish. There's very little in Kurdish that is not Muslim. But so this is one of 7 copies that we have. They're all in Syriac script, so it's not. I mean, Kurdish today is mostly written in Arabic script or in Roman script, but it's always in Garshuni. It's always preserved by Christian communities, and in this hymn, he kind of reflects on the chaos and violence of the world. He talks about how death has torn us apart. It's not left a single one of us alone, and we should kind of, he reflects on the crane which migrates from this area in the winter. It flies south and then comes back when things are better, and he kind of expresses this desire that that he wishes he could become like the crane and go out to a better area and then come back when things are safer and more pleasant in his community. So it's a really nice kind of poetic reflection on the world that he's faced with, and I'll leave it with that for this body of literature. But again, as I said, there's this is just like one tiny piece of what is out there from this region, because there's certainly, if you were looking into Muslim manuscripts, Jewish manuscripts, Armenian manuscripts, then you would see so much more, and so I think it's really just a really rich heritage and a manuscript culture that is not. I wouldn't say it's that they're producing that many manuscripts today exactly, but in very recent memory they were, and so it's a very cool manuscript culture to have available to us. So thanks, and I'd be happy to take your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Josh. You have shown us a very important rescue operation, and one can see how important these witness accounts are, also for historians. I have 2 questions. One is, what would it mean to go one step back? That means you are showing the rescued manuscripts from monasteries, but I'm unclear for whom were they written. If a rural person writes a first-person account, is he writing for the manuscript to be deposited at a monastery, or is he writing for the family, or is he writing for the community? What does he intend with this to do? Secondly, sometimes you were talking about unique manuscripts. Sometimes they're copies. Mm. Who copied? What was going on? How did they circulate? Did a few end up in the monastery? Others were still circulating? What is the history of these manuscripts? Mm-hmm. That's my first question. Mm-hmm. The second goes back to this rescue operation that you are part of. Mm-hmm. You have given us a brief insight on manuscripts that show the violence of the region during First World War and after. When you collect the manuscript, when you are trying to decide what to photograph, are you prioritizing? Are you saying, I want to look at those and maybe not at those yet? Or are you doing blanket photographs of a certain collection in a monastery or another site?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the second one. We do prioritize in a wide sense of trying to work in areas that have obvious threats to cultural heritage, war zones, places that are faced by various kinds of instability or climate issue, things that might make these manuscripts particularly endangered. That's not the only places in the world that we work, but it does shape our decisions about what to do and where. But within a particular library, once we have made an agreement with the owners of the manuscripts to photograph their materials, we typically photograph the entire collection and catalog and put it online, except there's exceptions if it's like privacy concerns, if it's too recent, data on community members and that sort of thing. But yeah, so within a library, we're not typically excluding. When Himmel started at mostly Benedictine monasteries in Western Europe, originally they said that they wouldn't photograph anything later than 1700, I think, or maybe even 1600, which was based on a very kind of Euro-American idea of when the manuscript era was and when it was not. But as Himmel has moved out to other parts of the world, I mean, beginning in Ethiopia already in the 1970s, it was clear that manuscript culture was still alive and they had to photograph things from all eras. So within a library, it's typically complete, complete. Now, to the first question, it's a great question about how they're produced and how they circulate and what the intention is in producing them. And I mean, the answer varies depending on the individual manuscript that you're looking at. Many manuscripts were produced at monasteries because the monks were the most likely to be literate and to have access to other books that they could use for their own research and writing. But speaking of the Christian tradition, particularly, but there were also, so for example, several of the manuscripts that I showed were from the monastery of St. Gabriel in Midyat, Turkey, and that collection, a lot of that collection had to be is very recent because a lot of it was destroyed in World War I, but it also has its own history because a lot of the books in that collection are liturgical books that were made at the monastery to be used in the churches of the various villages around. They were distributed to all these churches, but then so many of those villages have now been emptied out by migration to Europe and America and elsewhere. And so a lot of those books have ended up back in the monastery where they were produced as just a central holding place because there's no longer a community there that needs them. So there's that kind of circulation that can happen depending on the needs of the different communities. Now, if someone is writing a kind of eyewitness history of this invasion or something like that, yeah, it's difficult to say without having the beginning and end of the manuscript where they give that kind of data. It's hard to say exactly what the intention was. But I think what I wanted to suggest is that they wanted to have a record of how this all happened that could be available to the local Christian community in case anyone ever came asking, where they got these certain permissions and privileges that they were enjoying. Now, would that have been stored in a monastery or in a church or a house? It's hard to say exactly. Possibly at the, depending on who exactly the intended audience was. But yeah, so it really depends. But it's a great question, and sometimes we know more about them than others. A lot of Syriac manuscripts have very long colophons that tell you a lot about where and when and why they were created.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to follow up a bit on Liliana's question. I mean, this is a workshop in the history of material texts. You were looking at manuscripts. Some of them, you noted, show obvious signs of reading after they were written, right? So there's the account of the Armenian manuscript massacre that adds years, right? So somebody is looking at that after the fact. There is the manuscript that refers to the Ottoman Empire in ways that later readers would not understand. So somebody is obviously taking care to gloss that, right? So those are manuscripts that show signs of reading beyond their composition. And first part of consideration, can we think of a taxonomy of manuscripts that are annotated after the fact? I mean, another thing, something else that struck me was how very different some of these manuscripts are from one another. And I'm wondering about how one categorizes them. So, I mean, you had the two examples about Muhammad Pasha. So there's the attack on Al-Qush in Neo-Aramaic is a very neat manuscript. Is that formally copied, or is that somebody who just has a very good handwriting? The attack on Caesar just looks like a quickly jotted down note. Is that a longer text, or is that somebody just jotting down some thoughts on a piece of paper? The Hamidian massacres, that text is written in red and in brown. So somebody has taken care to copy it in multiple colors. Does that tell us something? The most remarkable example maybe is the history of the persecutions of the Christians, which exists in, you said, 5 manuscript copies that you have dated from 1949 to 1971. So obviously, those are texts that have a long life. The one with the polychrome border, that is that wasn't the Swedish edition. That was a manuscript. So that's a very formal page, formal manuscript. The other one you showed seemed to have been written on loosely lined paper. A very, very different kind of manuscript, presumably a very different kind of copyist, presumably a very different kind of use of the manuscript. So this is, a whole bunch of observations that I'm throwing you at once, but what do those material characteristics tell you about the category of manuscript, and what do those material characteristics tell you about how these specific manuscripts were thought of, written, used? So
Yeah.
Let's parse the category of manuscript a bit more finely.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're certainly right that there's a variety of contexts that lead to the production of these, and different levels of scribal training, of investment. There's many of these were produced by communities that didn't have a lot of money to do big, luxurious manuscripts. In many cases, the nicest manuscripts that were produced in these communities have ended up in Europe or in America, as with the illustrated Book of Protection from the beginning. Yeah. So I mean, you can and I think there was actually a question in the chat that was alluding to some of the kind of paleographical questions about these things. There's almost always the bulk of the text is in black or brown ink, but it's very common to have red as well for rubrication. So that's kind of the second most common. Now, as you said, the homily on the attack on Jizre is in a pretty kind of untrained hand, I would say. The lines are not very straight. It's also in the script style that's used by the Western Syriac communities, where most of this is from the Eastern Syriac communities. So there's probably a different sectarian affiliation that goes into that.
Do you mind just sharing the?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, let me try. Yeah, so yeah, so like these on this page are both in the Western Syriac script, even though they are now in right. So yeah, so this one, the one in Neo-Aramaic is in the Eastern Syriac script. The one in Syriac is in the Western Syriac script. But it's also, as you said, a kind of more scribbled hand that indicates that there was a different context for its production. This Neo-Aramaic attack on Al-Qush text, we only have the first 2 pages of it, I believe. So the rest of it is lost and would maybe tell us more at the end. So we can't say for sure how long it might have been, what would have been involved there. But yeah, this certainly on the Hamidian massacres is really a fairly unstandardized hand as well. And then certainly this Arabic script is very kind of cursive.
It's unstandardized, and yet it isn't the 2 colors, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah, they're still doing the rubrication.
Yeah.
Then we have a more like modern pen, like this purple, which is really only a late 19th or early 20th century phenomenon. But yeah, then with the history of Israel Odo, there are several manuscripts that are pretty nicely decorated. This one with the headpiece that wraps around it. This is kind of in the traditional style of the nicest Syriac manuscripts from this region. So, but the colors are new. The colors are really a modern color scheme. The pinks and the kind of light greens and blues. You would not see these. You would see the same kind of shapes on earlier Syriac manuscripts, but not the colors. But again, that just indicates that someone was willing to put a little money, a little time, extra time and effort into making this look really nice. And there's another manuscript that I don't have pictured here, which has these great headpieces kind of at the beginning of each section of the text. Even though in some other ways it's very simply produced. And many of these colored pens and things are much more easily accessible now than they would have been 200 years ago, for example. But yeah, and then this one on the left is written on lined paper. This is the one that was written in Aleppo in 1949. It was a priest who was living in Aleppo temporarily. He was originally from Iraq. But while he was there, he took the time to copy down this text.
Do you know what he was copying from?
No, I don't. We don't have anything earlier than this in our collections, and I don't know of any earlier than this.
Okay.
So, yeah.
More from the floor?
Well, we
There's
Peter
someone
has
online.
somebody
Can't
else.
see.
She,
Lowered his hand.
oh yeah, but she.
So it says
Peter.
Peter has his hand.
Peter or Annie?
Thanks very much, Josh. It was really, really fascinating. I mean, one of the things going back to the question of rubrication, I mean, I've looked at some Armenian manuscripts, and I don't know any Armenian, but what you can see very clearly, most of the ones I've looked at are liturgical, and there the rubrication is very clearly But what I'm seeing is quite a lot of rubrication that doesn't actually typify what you might call the Western tradition. You know, the Western tradition is nearly always the rubricationist has a very specific function. So could you tell me, I mean, it looked like to some of these manuscripts, they were just the titles or the prologues or I don't know what quite, you know, so red ink didn't seem to function in quite the way that I'm used to it functioning. Is this right, or am I? So, I mean, it also answers some of the question perhaps that Liliane was asking. When you get a systematic use through a manuscript of rubrication, it's nearly always a liturgical manuscript. So then it's precisely what you were describing, like a monastery is producing liturgical manuscripts for actual Christian services. But most of what you were showing was manuscripts about destruction. They're actually about the First World War or about, you know, real catastrophes that have happened. And these look more like historical manuscripts of a certain kind. So it also relates to Jerry's question. To what extent can you actually say, you know, if a manuscript doesn't have any rubrication, for instance, is it much more likely to be historical manuscript? Or when you've got a historical manuscript which begins with rubrication, what's the function of that rubrication?
Mhm. Yeah, very, very interesting question. I would say that in Middle Eastern manuscript traditions and let's say, how broad can I go with this? Maybe Islamic manuscript traditions in general. Rubrication is not limited to liturgical function, but is widely used for really a number of things. Here on the on many of these manuscripts, we have rubrication for what's essentially a long statement of the title. The title is kind of couched in a formulaic set of phrases that says, like, by the power of the Lord Jesus Christ, we begin to write the book about, and then you get the title, which itself is also long. In this case, you can see it here in the italics, and it is typically given in that full form. So rubrication is used for titles and headings of various sections of the text. It could it can be used, as on this manuscript as just kind of an interesting aesthetic contrast. In many, especially Islamic texts, rubrication is used to help indicate the structure of a commentary, where the core text will be in red and the commentary on it will be in black, and it'll kind of go back and forth repeatedly between them. So it really is just kind of a general way to set off one particularly important part of the text from others. In these Syriac manuscripts, it is basically titles and headings that it's being used for, as you can see here on the right. So if something is not rubricated, my typical assumption would be less so that it's a genre function and more that it is just a kind of less expensive, less luxury manuscript. That's not, that's not a one-to-one necessarily, but it is extremely common to have red, to have rubrication in addition to the black. Here again, it's just kind of the long title that gives the title and the author in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is abbreviated. Then it says we begin to write the directa of the attack on Al-Qush, and then it gives the author's name, it gives the date of composition. So it's really all the basic facts are captured there, and it's as speaking as a cataloger, it's extremely helpful in kind of identifying what the core information is that the manuscript wants to convey to you. But you can see also that they've just kind of like given a little decoration, just alternating black and red below the title there too.
Davina?
Yeah, thank you. I'm interested in the cataloging and in maybe the finding aids that you set up for these manuscripts. you said that your library negotiates with a whole collection, and I'm wondering how those collections were organized themselves. I mean, we saw the picture of the barrels with stacks of books in them and so on, but I wonder what kinds of shape you know, if what kinds of rooms and what kinds of setups and sequences of things. And you said to Lilian that you kind of just do, once you get that, you're going through. Do you keep track of what's next to each other, or do you I'm thinking of different library organizations, like old British libraries versus, Dewey Decimal and American, and so how do you keep any track of those kinds of information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our typical way of working is that when we have made an agreement with a library to photograph their collection, we provide the equipment, the cameras, etc. We provide training to help them know how to photograph, and then we hire someone from the local community to photograph the material, and then they send it to us on hard drives. They get a copy. They get a hard drive copy. We get a hard drive copy. We put a hard drive, or we put another copy on like magnetic tape in a mountain in Utah where it can't be destroyed by anything. But so we typically rely on the community itself to kind of maintain that organization based on what they already know about their library. And it really depends from one collection to another. Some of them are very clearly organized. They have shelf mark numbers, and some of them have kind of categorical shelf mark numbers where it's like theology number 12 and history number 15. So we record those when we put them on our reading room online. We record whatever shelf marks seem to be the most current. But as far as what that actually looks like on the shelves of the building itself, it's hard to say and probably varies pretty widely from one to another.
Okay, I mean, thorny question about a manuscript library that doesn't have manuscripts is what kind of information are you capturing on binding on paper and paper quality? So I mean, we saw the one that's on lined loose leaf paper, so that's pretty obvious. But do your photographers or informants give you the kind of information about something is on fine paper, something is on crummy paper, right? Do you capture information about binding? And so how detailed is your knowledge of the physical characteristics of the manuscripts? I would assume that if you're dealing with a whole lot of kind of local informants and photographers in war-torn places, that these are not trained bibliographers, but are you providing training so that you are capturing the kind of information that that would presumably be captured if a library were digitizing its own manuscript holdings?
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer is unfortunately very little. That those kinds of codicological questions are basically something that we have more or less left for people to look at the images. We because it is, as a digitization project, it is very difficult to capture a lot of that information without having a real kind of detailed back and forth, like as you said, with training on those things with the owners. We do actually preserve images of the binding as much as possible from the front, from the side, from the top and bottom, so that someone can actually look at that, which I think is fairly different from what we were doing in the microfilm era, where when I look at the microfilms, they typically don't really have the binding on them at all, partially because the photo quality would be so bad that you wouldn't be able to tell much. So with the color digital images, you can actually see, you can if you know what you're looking for, you can start to see, okay, this is like a leather binding or whatever.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, the answer is that's really been a secondary priority for the cataloging, and we focused more on.
Are you getting different kinds of information, different levels of information from manuscripts photographed in European monastic libraries?
I think so. I think some of our older cataloging from Western Europe has more of that kind of data that's often coming from like print catalogs of those collections and that sort of thing. So with the collections in other parts of the world, some of them have print catalogs and others. So, yeah, it really varies.
You can't see the screen, so we don't know. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is very outside of my wheelhouse, so like super fascinating. I wanted to go back to something Liana brought up, and maybe you'd answered it, it's just usually this is just a topic that's so familiar to me. I'm curious to have more clarification with in terms of the purpose of the manuscript versus print. So especially as recent as 11 years ago, right? So what kind of the the fundamental purpose behind participating in this tradition, and especially the translations seem to be like actively participating, consciously participating in this somewhat more archaic way of speaking, at least from the way that it was translated.
Oh, sure.
So I'm just curious what the kind of impetus behind participating in this tradition is, and I'm wondering because I'm kind of more familiar with kind of comics and versus art books, and maybe is that a possible kind of point of comparison, where it's like why do visual artists produce art books when they could produce more easily consumable comics that are reproducible, but some of the same artists then choose to also create but only maybe 50 copies of a particular book, and that is like hand printed. So I'm like curious whether it's sort of similar to that dichotomy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most of what's here from really recent decades is like later notes that have been added into existing manuscripts. I mean, we do have this history of the genocides was copied as late as 1971 in manuscripts. So that's very recent in terms of manuscript production. We do have some other materials in our collections that were copied in manuscript in pretty recent years. And yeah, there's a number of different reasons for that. So if you are going back 100 years or more, then as I said, many of these communities were just rural enough that they had limited access to print, or they were maintaining kind of long-standing monastic traditions of manuscript production that you actually want in your church to have a handwritten liturgical book and not a print one, because that's the way it's always been, and because you're replacing a book that may have existed before that was destroyed in World War I. Now it's different as you get much more recent than that, and some people I think really there's a kind of like spiritual practice there that they want to write it by hand. I have to believe that with some like this long history of the genocides that there is some level of kind of paying it the proper respect by copying it out by hand, and decorating it, but other people like in the Dominican Friars of Mosul collection, we photographed probably like 75 manuscripts that were written by an Iraqi priest between like the 1960s and 80s or something like that, and I think he just it was like a hobby. I think he just loved to like write stuff. He had beautiful handwriting in Arabic. I think it was really just his thing. He just like loved making manuscripts, and they weren't fancy, most of them, but so there can be a hobbyist element to it like that, that probably connects to some of what you're saying about like art books and those sorts of things. And then there's also some manuscripts I think recent manuscripts are produced because they are not meant for publication. They're kind of someone's collection of notes, or they might be a church record. Sometimes there's like a church will have like a printed book that's just like a form, where it's like spaces to put records of baptisms and marriages and stuff like that. And so they just copy it out in the existing, it says like spouse A, spouse B, whatever. So, yeah, there's a variety of reasons for that. But it is rare, but I think noteworthy when people are really producing something like this history manuscript that looks that carries on so much of the pre-modern tradition. Yeah.
John?
Thanks, Josh. Question about the colophons. I mean, certainly one of the interesting things about this talk is the way that at least some of these materials are continually being written on and in. And I don't know if you think you have enough evidence, or you and your colleagues, to be able to talk to us, or to sort of write a mini history of the desire to notate in older documents, but to continue a practice of notating their current histories. I mean, that, is antithetical to the way most libraries deal with any materials. These are obviously, but it's obviously a much older tradition too, that is part of what's being continued. So this kind of very recent annotation strategy in time of crisis is interesting. You gave us a couple of examples. Are those outliers? Are those, is that a practice in some of these places to write the current history when that history is disrupted? So that's one question. And my other question is, I guess you could kick around if you want, as you're a cataloger. I'm intrigued by the idea of a historian who wants to write the military history of Mosul needing to find evidence in the books that you're describing, which presumably no historian would ever do. This is not, no one would go to the Hill, I don't think, to write the history of the US occupation of Iraq, and yet maybe they should. Can you offer in your description something that tells people from very different fields that this is actually, these are materials that tell us about, 21st century imperialism? I mean, whatever, the many topics and violent confrontations between cultures that you're describing here. Thanks.
Yeah, so on the first question, yeah, I'll go back again to the collection of the St. Gabriel Monastery in Midyat, because that collection is extremely rich in terms of not only the history of the collection that I described earlier, but also the amount of notation that's been put into capturing the history of the manuscripts and their communities beyond the moment of production. So I showed some examples of kind of notes that trace, this manuscript was copied in the 1830s, but someone came, and actually multiple someones needed to describe what happened to it in the 1910s and the 1920s and on into the 60s and 70s. And there's a note describing the visit of Sebastian Brock, who's a very famous Syriac scholar who came to the monastery, studied this manuscript, and
we got to start doing that.
Wrote an article about it. Yeah. Yeah. So it really is, the manuscript is a living document in a way that
tradition that we completely lost.
Yeah. And that, I do think that collection is a bit of an outlier in that sense, because there were clearly some of the monks there who were really, they were very interested in documenting a lot of that history for whatever reason, but they were also living through a real turmoil with their communities moving on to Europe. There's multiple notes that are kind of the reflections of those left behind. So you get some really powerful stuff. You also get, like, one of them has a whole printout of all the people from this village who now live in Germany and Sweden, who donated money to fix up the church in their home village.
And
so
that's a colophon,
so
that's something in appendix.
it's printed out on a piece of paper and they stuck it in the back of the
Stuck it.
manuscript, but it has everyone's name and the amount of euros they gave to build it, to donate, fix up
You
the church.
transcribe all that, you probably.
No, I don't transcribe all that,
Or-
but I do, but to your second question, I do try to include in the cataloging information, notes that help people to find those kinds of information so that, I mean, for example, I cataloged these things several years ago, but I had to go back and find them all for this presentation. And
Right.
so I'm searching for keywords, World War I, attack, church, whatever, like, things that-
ISIS. I mean,
ISIS, yeah.
Real contemporary stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So the things that we try to include enough in the cataloging that if someone wants to find that, they can, and if they can't, then they can ask us.
Question about the relationship of the manuscript to print, which you noted several times that people living in hill towns don't have access to print, but something like Nadir Shah's siege of Mosul, a major, presumably military siege by a major regional emperor. Couple of questions. Was there a printing press in Mosul? What are print accounts of the siege of Mosul? Are there 18th century print accounts of the siege of Mosul? Are they coming from Mosul? Are they coming from the imperial center of Nadir Shah? Do print accounts tell us something different from manuscript accounts of a historical event of this sort? So what are the other documentary sources for the siege of and why would these accounts not have made their way into print?
Right.
Yeah.
So I can't say with 100% certainty, but I believe that there was not yet a printing press in Mosul at this time. This was 1730s. This is just about the time that the first Muslim-run printing press in the Islamic world is getting started in Constantinople. But that's the imperial capital, and it's closely connected to Europe, and Mosul is more of a provincial town. There are some Christian and Jewish presses in other parts of the empire, but as far as I know, not in Mosul yet at this time, more in Lebanon and Syria and Anatolia. Now, it wouldn't have been too long after that. Probably in the 19th century, the Dominicans brought press to Mosul, and they had a pretty substantial printing operation there. Now, so yes, there are other accounts of this and other conquests of Nadir Shah. In the Austrian National Library, we photographed 2 histories of that were written by like a court historian of his reign in Iran. But so and those are manuscripts. There would have been some print accounts of him produced somewhere, I'm sure. I mean, Europeans would have taken some notice of his conquests, and there would have been a growing European presence in South Asia and Iran. But all of but those manuscripts from Iran and those print accounts are going to give a very different perspective on these events versus a Christian villager who got called into the city to help defend it. Now, why did these I mean, I think that these accounts were written. There's probably only one copy of them in the world in manuscript, and it was never the priority of the people who were printing things, which in any case would have been probably a century later in Mosul. So yeah, I mean, there's many things like that. Yeah.
Davida, last question from Davida.
So this discussion just now makes me think about, the choice of libraries and mainly religious institutions as the site to try and reach out to see if they have manuscripts as compared to administrative offices, governmental offices. or other, I don't know, schools or other places. And I know about even individual families. I know that in Israel, the Ethiopian immigrants turn out to have their own almost clan-based tradition of copying sacred texts, and they become family artifacts. And a scholar I know in Tel Aviv has started trying to get those digitized. I can give you more information about it if you want, but they're still going on. They still use them as the center of their family practices, and they brought them with them from Ethiopia to Israel. So, I mean, I'm just thinking about the kinds of places that your collection is maybe oversampling things that are religious, storehouses. It makes perfect sense, but it's fascinating to think about other places where, these cross documents, whose account of this siege, are you getting, and whose account, is not being digitized. It's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, there is a mix in here. Some of the manuscripts I showed are in private collections of Iraqi Christians. So Father Najib in Mosul is doing a mixture of photographing religious institutions, but also private collections. Now, I mean, as you said, the manuscripts that they have in their private collections often have a religious flavor to them as well, like the Ethiopian ones that are used for religious practice. But not always. Some of them are, I mean, we have a collection of a poet who wrote down a lot of his poetry, which is, I mean, I'm sure somewhat religious, but not like religious texts exactly. And then there's these kinds of histories, the Durak Yatza and so on. But yes, I mean, it is the places that have large manuscript collections tend to be religious institutions of some sense, although that's not all we've worked with a number of, like in Mali, kind of cultural preservation organizations. In South Asia, we're doing a lot of, universities, cultural foundations, all sorts of things. So it is a mix, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I promised Davita's question would be the last one, but then I have a question, which is, I mean, how do you scout out manuscript sources related to Davita? I mean, do you have people on the ground who are finding things, or do you wait for institutions to come to you and volunteer that we have some stuff you might be interested in?
Yeah, we get some of both. In the past, it's mostly been us looking for them, but as we become better known, we also get people looking for us. But for example, right now we're doing a lot of work in India and Pakistan, and we have kind of a person employed in each country to scout out different collections, and once we've done some work in that community, then it becomes easier to say, like, okay, this is a known presence, and so they worked with this other collection. You can trust them to work with you. In the past, a lot of it has been our director, Columbus Stewart, and his predecessors kind of doing lots of travel on the ground. And I mean, the very first collection they wanted to photograph in the 60s was the Benedictine collection in Italy, at the center of the Benedictine world. And they got permission from the abbot, and they got to the monastery and said, "We're here to photograph your collection." And the librarian said, "No, I don't care what the abbot thinks." So they ended up moving on and just kind of wandering around until they found a place in Austria that would let them photograph. So there's always that kind of give and take to some extent as well. But it's a lot of just word of mouth and kind of like making the visits and connections, and Columba's very good at all that. So, but we have various field representatives as well who help keep those connections alive. Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think we've got quite a lot.